Hello and welcome to On Geopolitics, this podcast from the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge, where we look at geopolitical issues in a historical context. I'm Suzanne Rain and I'm joined, as usual, by Ali Ansari. Today, we're going to talk about summits. You may have noticed this year there have been a whole load of summits, G7, the COP28, the G20, and you might be forgiven for asking what they're all for, given that so far none of them seem to have actually resolved all the multiple difficult issues that we're dealing with at the moment. So we've invited to join us today Dr. Tristen Naylor, who's Assistant Professor in History and Politics at Cambridge and is an expert in international summits and diplomacy. So who better to answer all our questions? Ali, if it's all right, I'm going to start with the first question.
You fire off.
Tristen, is there a definition of what is a summit?
Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me. I'm always happy to talk about international summits, perhaps more than is healthy to. As for the definition of what is a summit, there's no real sort of single settled definition, but the way that I tend to think about it is that it is a meeting of those who are at the apex, at the very top of their political hierarchies. So prime ministers and presidents and monarchs, basically those who answer to nobody figuratively above them. That is what really is at the core of summitry.
Obviously, this is a sort of silly question, but who invented them? Is there a point where they started to call that kind of meetings summits?
Well, I don't think that's a silly question at all. We have, certainly in the historical record or historical records, we have lots of examples of summitry, lots of examples throughout antiquity of those at the apex, at the top of their political hierarchies, meeting, just thinking of the British context, something like in the Middle Ages, the Field of Cloth of Gold, the sort of now infamous meeting between Henry VIII and Francois I. That's often regarded as a pinnacle moment in international summitry, but really it is a 20th century phenomenon. It really is only once it becomes easier, cheaper, and safer to travel that summitry as a practice gets going. Before this, it is very much an ad hoc and very, very extraordinary event. Even in the beginning of the 20th century, it is an extraordinary thing. So really, truly, we're looking at the latter half of the 20th century when leaders, as a matter of routine, begin getting together, and this sort of becomes established international practice and established and, if not completely routine, near routine part of the overall diplomatic toolkit.
So, Tristen, is that so? One of the things that you're defining is really the routine nature of it, the fact that it becomes a regular part of the diplomatic calendar, and it becomes possible, basically.
So I think it's important to sort of categorize summitry into different types. We have the ad hoc, the one-offs that are things like peace conferences. Again, sort of thinking of the 20th century context, something like the Yalta Conference being really important, but a one-off thing. And I think this is distinctly different as a practice, as a centerpiece of international politics than the more routine annual conferences, whether we're talking about the G7, the G20, whether we're talking about the COP process or even the EU summits. These are routine. These are baked into a leader's calendar. And both categories are summits, but they're different. I think they're sufficiently different entities that we should treat them, at least, analytically as scholars, differently.
So, I mean, just to follow on from that. So if they're sort of part of this is the danger, isn't it, really, if people are looking at these things, if they become a routine part of a calendar of statesmen and diplomats and others, then they become a little bit, they seem to become almost an end in themselves. You just go to these summits because it seems to be, well, it's part of the calendar. It's a routine. It's what you do, but it doesn't actually achieve much, does it? Isn't that the danger that we're getting with the regularity of summits?
I think that's a great observation and a great question. And I think there really is that risk. The proliferation and increase in frequency of these events decreases how special they are. What I think makes summitry really work is when it is an extraordinary thing. To really work, to sort of have that diplomatic magic, it needs to be seen as a momentous moment. And if it becomes routine, just another meeting, you lose that. You lose that sense of urgency, of specialness. It means that the incentives for those back home working away as civil servants in the bureaucracies, there's less incentive to produce something, to get an agreement that really, really matters, because it's just part of the routine. It's just another meeting. This is, incidentally, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, the shift to online summitry, both sort of at the height of the COVID pandemic and now sort of in this, I don't know, what are we, late pandemic now, in this period of sort of like hybrid summitry. And one of the dangers I think that we risk with moving fully to online summits is it really takes away the momentousness, the spectacle, the specialness of individuals at the top of their political hierarchies getting together. Because frankly, if you're just sitting at home and having a meeting online, it's hard to imagine anything less special, less extraordinary than that. And so the online virtual summitry is sort of an extreme case, but we can see this certainly now with a number of summits that are seen as quite routine. In the past weeks, of course, we've had the COP climate change summit. They're now at least treated as being big events every single year. And I think that this is not great. I think that, there really is something to be said if it's only every few years, 4 years, 5 years, because then it is something that is special. And when something's special, then extraordinary things are demanded of it. Whereas now COP just seems to be like a big annual trade fair, just another sort of annual circus that people show up to. And what's discussed there matters, really matters in a profound existential way. And if this is our best bet for addressing climate change, that we no longer treat this as a special thing, I think we're in trouble.
Can I ask Tristen, because I just did a quick search on when these three summits that we think of most in our calendar, of the G7, the G20, and the COP summit. They were COP and the G20, I think. So COP was 1995, G20 was 1999. Actually, G7 was a lot earlier. That was 1975. But what you're talking about then is a moment where somebody says, things are really bad. We need to set up something to sort this out. And at that point, it could be a conference. And I'm thinking now of the Yalta conference, which was, I think, not a summit. Did they call it a summit?
I'm not sure if they called it a summit at the time. Yeah. I mean, interestingly, it is Churchill who coins the term summit as summit. I'm of course going to forget the quote right now, and this is the time not to forget. But here we are.
I'm already converted, Tristen. That's it. I mean, now that you've revealed,
our listeners can this is like homework at home for the listeners.
There we are. But
find the Churchill quote
that it's necessary to have a parlay at the top.
Yeah.
So whether or not he called it a summit there and then, or it came after, I'm not sure. But sorry, go on.
Well, then, so obviously something happened in 1975 that made the G7 think we've got to get together and talk about this in a different way. And then clearly we had this period in the late 1990s where the G20 and the COP summits got set up. So are you saying that there is there's a moment where it becomes clear that things are sufficiently bad that people need to get together and do something about it? And then the problem is that they create this thing, which is a great coming together, and then they don't really know. You can see what happens is essentially you have lots of productive discussions and they say, God, it's great to meet. We should set up loads of work streams. We should get all our civil servants and Sherpas and everybody on this. And then they walk away and go on to the next thing, and they leave behind a whole load of people with often random, actually unachievable tasks. And then they say, well, let's all come back together next year and see how we're all doing. I mean, is that what happens? Is that how we're stuck in this pattern now?
The short response is yes. Summits respond to crises. When things are so bad that established mechanisms for responding to bad things, when that's not going to work, then you call a summit. You call for a parley at the top. The G7 begins in 1975 in response to the financial crises really of the day. It is principally amongst finance ministers meeting at the IMF that they realize that they cannot resolve things either through their own domestic political systems or sort of at the multilateral level through the IMF. And so first it's finance ministers that meet. It's a very close-knit club. At the time, it was Scholz, Giscard, who really drove the process, as well as Schmidt in West Germany, who then very quickly end up becoming, at least in the case of Giscard of France and Scholz, becoming heads of government. And they get together at first, what's going to be the G5, to talk about how to steer the world out of the financial crisis. This then becomes the G6 with the addition of Italy, and then the G7 the following year with Canada. The exact same thing happens in the late 90s with the G20. It's also first established at the finance ministers level to respond principally to the Asian financial crisis. They see value in meeting. And then it's in 2008, in response to the global financial crisis, that the G20 becomes first elevated to the level of leaders. And then, of course, with the COP, it's response to the climate crisis. So it is always in response to crisis that this extraordinary phenomenon is produced. But then institutions don't tend to die. They just go on. They endure. And so we end up in the situation where we find ourselves, where they go on even though the crisis is over. And they also...
Or not over. I'm interrupting you to say what's conspicuous about things like the COP, and that's why there's been so much criticism, is that essentially they just become a means of perpetuating a discussion about the crisis rather than saying, well, I don't know. Sorry.
And I think, I think what differentiates the COP, say, from the G summits is that the challenge of climate change is just so much greater, so much more difficult to not just address, but get political agreement on than, say, a global financial crisis, which is not to say that a global financial crisis isn't bad, but particularly in the G summitry context, sort of the range of solutions is broadly agreed upon. And so they can make progress on it. So these things endure, but there's also then mission creep, because institutions tend not to die, and institutions sort of have a bureaucratic logic of their own, and then they grow and they grow. And this is something that I think we particularly see with the G20, that has become so enormously expansive with its engagement groups, its outreach groups, its year-long process, that we are so far away from what was originally envisaged with the G7 as being a quiet, intimate, fireside chat between just a very small select group, indeed self-selected, but a select group of leaders.
So coming on to the fireside chat bit, because this, having been a civil servant, it's difficult to accept, but I think sometimes we have to accept it, that there's the preparation for summits, which is, as you just said, it's a long-term, ongoing thing. You have whole departments in ministries whose job is to prepare for the summit, and as soon as it's finished, to prepare for the next one. And then this question about, for me, how much of what comes out of a summit is actually agreed before the summit happens between the different Sherpa teams and things. I know you've been part of those. And how much it really matters that the leaders come and have those quiet fireside chats, often over a little bit too much food and drink, that can be the things that tip essentially the impossible to negotiate final declaration into something that everybody can agree with. And what's your view on that balance between the two?
It's important to sort of pull apart, to disaggregate what happens at summits and sort of what the objectives are. I think a lot of scholarship, a lot of attention is placed on the formal policy negotiation process for very good reason. And this is exactly as you point out, this is the stuff that is a year-round process negotiated by the Sherpas. The Sherpas are the personal representatives of leaders who meet with one another throughout the year to plan the summit. And they're really the ones who are chiefly responsible for negotiating the summit outcome document, what's typically called the communique. And that's good and that's important. It's deliberative. It is painful work.
And you've been involved in that multiple times.
Yeah. I have endured the pain. I have seen the pain. It is we often talk about sort of how incredibly dry and dull it must be for diplomats to negotiate over colons and semicolons and periods and the language. But this really is what goes on in the Sherpa meetings, particularly the Sherpa meetings closest to the leaders actually getting together and meeting and really just sort of signing off on what's been negotiated. So there's that process. But then there is the human element of international summits, which I think also has value, but it is a different value. It's a different purpose. What is important, to be frank, is not what leaders say when they're sitting around the formal summit table. Particularly if we take a summit like the G20, we're talking about, there are tons of people in the room. It's not just the leaders, it's their Sherpas, it's usually their finance minister. These rooms are very, very large. These aren't intimate environments. It's usually just the the reading of pre-prepared statements. What matters, what has value, is what happens on the margins. It is when the meeting is adjourned, when they're having a break, when they go, leaders will have quiet chats with one another in the corner. It's what we call the pull aside or the brush by, the informal bilateral.
Is everybody standing in the corridors hoping to get a brush by? I mean, there's a skill to that.
There is every game imaginable being played. I mean, often, particularly in the context of something like the UN General Assembly, UNGA, every year in September, a lot of delegations don't want to meet one another at all. And so sometimes you'll have entire teams of diplomats running interference, like American football players, to keep their leader away from another leader. But then another, I won't mention names, but I've seen leaders in between sessions quite awkwardly just sort of standing around waiting for somebody to come their way, and so that they can have a brush by with them, because they really need to have a word. So every sort of like
it sounds like these meetings that are frequently meant to occur between the American and the Iranian presidents at the United Nations. And I think there was one case where the Iranian president hid in a lift or something, to avoid bumping into the American president. But they were trying to organize something. But you're quite right. I mean, I think, one of the, it's a bit like an academic conference, actually. You don't go to an academic conference to listen to the papers. You go for the socializing in the margins and talking to people and networking and building, I hate to say that, but, there's an element of that.
Yes, Ali, we're going to edit that bit out. Otherwise,
we've all lost our jobs.
Collapse.
No, but I mean, there is a corollary to it. I mean, I think, and it is true that a lot of the formulaic nature of conferences, where you get these pat speeches and people sort of give their sort of their sort of very routine and official narratives, and then behind the scenes they go off and have a chat, which actually can be quite meaningful. So I mean, I can see we said quite a bit really about how these things are not much good, but I think. Summits, if there is a value to summits, quite apart from having these meetings, which is better to talk, obviously, than not to. But it's also the informality. It's actually the informal aspects of it that are the best bits in some ways. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's what, there are ongoing debates about whether or not summits are worth it. They're very, very complicated things. They're very expensive things to have. I'm of the position that they are worth it, but not because of any particular communique that's negotiated, but rather these are opportunities for individuals who otherwise wouldn't be able to speak directly without the gaze of others that are typically on them. And that is profoundly important. Just thinking back a couple of weeks to the G20 summit in Bali, I was there. I couldn't, it's only been a couple of weeks. Maybe this says something about my memory, but like I couldn't tell you what's in the communique. But that's not to say that this wasn't an important summit. It was profoundly important. One, it allowed President Xi and President Biden to meet face to face. They met on the eve of the summit for 3 hours and 13 minutes. This otherwise would not have happened without the G20 summit taking place. And then the other really big important thing that happened was on the second morning of the summit, after the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had left. The Russians launched a missile barrage on Ukraine, and there was an emergency G7 summit called on the margins of the G20. This also, it just wouldn't have happened if all of these leaders, they would have had a call, it would have been online, but they were all together in the same place at the same time and able to meet and figure out what their response was going to be. So it matters. But my position is it doesn't matter because of what's negotiated. It matters because these are opportunities for conversations that otherwise wouldn't take place. And the trouble is that's sort of an intangible value, and it's really hard to justify that, but it's worth it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? Because you're not getting actually anything tangible in that you hope it will develop into something. But at the same time, because it's not fixed in a text, there can be some room for disagreeing about what on earth was said. I mean, one of the aspects of the whole nuclear negotiations that occurred really between the P5+1 in Iran was some of the most interesting discussions occurred one-to-one between John Kerry and the Iranian foreign minister, and they went privately with no one else with them. But of course, that was also hugely problematic because we don't actually know what they said to each other. And, one side will say, oh, well, he promised me this. And the other side said, well, they assured me of that. The problem with that is there's huge value, I would say, and I'd agree with you on that. There's huge value in the sense that, these two individuals can sit for 3 hours around Lake Geneva and have a chat. The negative side, of course, is that nobody else really knows what they said. So it's also possibly a recipe for further disagreement down the line. I mean, there is that issue, isn't there, that even with these communiques, of course, is that, what we're doing here is we're in trying to satisfy everyone. We actually, we're not, I don't know whether it's either simplifying something or overcomplicating something. I mean, it's in both ways. It's actually making that thing unworkable in some ways without further reflection or further discussion. I mean, I know diplomats love it in some ways. Some diplomats love it, I should say, but it's not I think looking at it, you have to wonder, yes, at the end of the day, have these summits become too large, too enormous, and actually you could benefit from these smaller meetings by having slightly, is it less or fewer? Suzanne will correct me. Fewer summits.
No, is it? I don't know. It depends what you're going to say next. I can't guess until you finish your sentence.
Right. Well, don't worry. Having less or fewer, but slightly more intense, slightly more focused on particularly getting the right people together. I mean, presumably also getting the right people together is very important as well.
Absolutely. So if we take the current geopolitical context, one thing that I worry about is that the G20 is not built for the world that we presently find ourselves in. What we need are groups with fewer people doing less. And
you win, star
there we
guest.
go. All the points. Let's end the podcast there. I won't do better than that.
Absolutely.
These are the G20 works. Indeed, any summit works when actors are, by and large, are on the same side of a problem. This is not to say that rivals can't meet. Obviously, they do. And obviously, that has a tremendous value when it works. But what we have right now is rivalry shifting to outright antagonism. And when we talk about a process that's as expansive as the G20, it's really hard to get agreement on certainly the big things that really matter when we're talking about actors at the table who not just disagree with one another on fundamental things, but are outright engaged in conflict with one another. And so I think the G20 presently is very much a product of the post-Cold War, mid to late 1990s sort of globalization or sort of zenith of globalization era where we've reached the end of history and we're all good now and we can govern globally. This was a period when then the G7 seemed like a bit of an anachronism. It wasn't clear what this was for. Self-selected club of Western-focused leaders, no longer the world's largest economies. Why are they continuing to meet? But now, in the moment in which we find ourselves, I think these clubs have sort of swapped positions, and the G7 has found a new lease on life. The G7 can very clearly articulate, for the first time in a long time, what it's all about, what it's for, and what its added value is. We've seen since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February, the G7 meet either in person or online an extraordinary number of times. I think between February and June, the leaders met 6 times. That's never happened before. They were focused on a single issue.
Wow.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine. And these were leaders that all agree on some really fundamental things, that democracy is worth protecting, that the violation of a sovereign state's, sovereignty is against international law. These are conversations that work well in a like-minded small group like the G7, but conversations that just are non-starters in a far more diverse, some would say far more legitimate representative group like the G20. And so I do think that we should, the kinds of summits we're likely to see being successful, at least in the near term, or however long this sort of era of geopolitical stability lasts, it is going to be the groups with fewer people around the table talking about, fewer things.
So that's really interesting, because one of the things that I had a look at when I was pulling together my thoughts for this were the rotating presidencies of the G20 and the G7. And of course, the G20, which was formed in 1999, if it's got 20, then we've just come round somehow. So some countries have been very patient and they've let everyone else host it. And now it's going to be their turn. And so we've got next India, then Brazil, then South Africa, I think. And that, of course, is exactly as you're saying. I mean, that is a shifting of the centre of gravity to those countries who have a very significant role to play in the shaping of how we resolve some of the conflicts that we're currently in, but who are not part of the G7 mechanisms, who wouldn't necessarily have the same conversations exactly as you've just been saying about, what are we fighting for? What are our values and all the rest of it? So then you kind of think, well, but it is critical, clearly, to get that group of countries together. Probably really important to recognise that it performs a completely different function from UNGA, which is everybody, and therefore necessary but difficult. And this one, I mean, you are going to have a very different set of conversations when they're in Brazil and South Africa, I assume.
Every presidency gets to choose what the agenda is. Every presidency begins with the government declaring that this summit's going to be different, this summit's going to be special, we're putting our own brand on it. And I don't know, maybe I'm too much of a cynic, but it always ends up being the same stuff. And that's fine. That's all right. But it certainly, as we've gone through this first revolution of the G20 hosts, these were big moments for the new members at the top table of global economic governance. Just thinking of Indonesia, which currently holds the presidency of the G20, this is an enormous thing. I mean, getting into the club and then let alone getting to host your, that year's party is, it's sort of like the debutante's ball. It announces their arrival on the world stage as a leading economy of significance. And that really matters. That really matters particularly for domestic politics, that a leader gets to say to their domestic constituency, and this assumes a particular form of government, but look, we, or for a leader, typically I, have sway on the world stage, and I really matter. And so it is particularly the newer entrants to the club that really pull out all the stops for an international summit. I wrote down the number when I was there. I think it was the Indonesians held 267 meetings under their presidency.
Wow.
Which is both an indication of how expansive, how big this process has gotten, but also sort of how they see it and their leadership within it. They want their year to be big, and it's easy to understand why. So yes, every country sort of adds their distinct sort of flavor to it. Every country will more or less sort of steer it the agenda to issues that they want, but by and large. And again, particularly because the G20, in terms of its remit, has expanded to include just about everything. Well, everything is then on the agenda.
Who pays for that, by the way, Tristen? I mean, so Indonesia having 267 or however many it was. I mean, do they stump up, or is there? Do they pay for most of that, or is it
the host pays for it? Of course, most the travel costs are paid by every individual member, but. The big bill is footed by the host.
Wow, that's quite...
One of the things that's quite curious about the G7 and the G20 is there's no secretariat.
Right.
There's no permanent G-summitry civil service or anything like that managing this. There's no permanent budget. It is sort of every host government every year either sets up or beefs up their summitry office to run it.
So it does give an opportunity. I mean, this has to be a good thing, doesn't it? If it gives an opportunity for those who are seen as, the not in the great power system, basically an ability and a way to sort of access, that diplomatic circuit and to do it quite effectively, really. I mean, they do manage to get the ear of other countries.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important for if we think about things like status politics, and if we think about status concerns as driving particularly geopolitical contestation, this idea that a country is not being recognized with the status that they deserve, and so will act in a particular way, say that is violent, that is contrary to, say, international law. Inclusion in these summits is a way to give status. We've spent a lot of time talking about UN Security Council reform. It's not happening and remains unlikely at this moment in time. That means that if that system is stuck, if that system is like stuck in 1945, you've got all these status concerns bubbling up. But one thing that I think is super interesting, but also important about the G20 is, in a way, well, we've had that reform. We've got a forum where those that believe that they should be at the top table are at, if not the top table, a top table. And I think that matters. I think that matters a great deal.
Can I ask a question then? Because I think that's a convincing case for having the G20. What about if you're not invited, or if you do turn up but everybody doesn't like you very much? And I was just thinking about Russia a bit. And I was noting, Vladimir Putin went to Astana in October and took part in 3 summits in Astana. That was the Council of Heads of the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Russia Central Asian Summit, and the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia. So they're having a whole load of summits as well. And I suppose what we don't want, in order to, if we're aiming for world harmony, is summit blocks developing. Yeah. Clearly, we see most the summits that our governments are involved in. We see least the summits that we're not involved in. How do you see the risk of summit blocks?
So summits, you're always going to have them. It's inevitable, right? It is. Summits typically are alike actors getting together, either alike geographically, alike ideologically or politically, or alike in that they are allied with respect to a crisis, whether that crisis is a war or whatnot. So you're always going to end up with a bloc, with a clique, really. Yeah. That can't be avoided. But if we're talking about global summitry, governing a global process or responding to a global crisis, and leaders begin opting out because it is uncomfortable for them to be there, then that has an effect on the likely efficacy of that particular summit. It's not seen as being important because it's missable. And this gets back to what we were discussing earlier, that the more routine these things become, then the easier it is to say, I'm going to give this one a miss because I'll just go next year, or it doesn't really matter. Nothing gets done there anyway. So there's a balance to be struck in terms of frequency and in terms of there's no way to extract, at least right now, a cost on a leader for not attending, at least at the global level. It might be seen domestically as not a great thing that they weren't there, or conversely, it actually might seem like a good thing that they weren't there. Maybe thumbing your nose at what's seen as an illegitimate or as a Western or whatever institution comes with benefit, and any particular leader is going to make that calculation and act accordingly. But I've been at summits and I've seen when individuals are in the room and it's really awkward because nobody wants to talk to them, or very few people want to talk to them. And for me, doing what I do, in many ways, those are some of the most interesting moments in what is otherwise, at least in the formal meeting, can be quite dull, routine, and boring. Just the thing that immediately comes to mind is at the G20 summit in the wake of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and when the Crown Prince, MBS, walked into the room and quite what his reception was.
Isn't that the meeting where Putin high-fived him?
That was exactly that moment.
That was the meeting, yeah.
So do you plot, Tristen? Well, I just wondered, do you plot summits of which summits are happening in your year planner, and then you can work out who's at which ones? Because there must be some sort of compulsive summit attenders, and then others. It's like who's most invited, who's not invited very much, who's invited a lot and never shows. And then there's a question, we're going to have to wrap up soon, but then there's this question as well about using summits for lobbying and sponsorship, which I know came out massively in the case of what was happening in Cairo. So there's a lot of questions in there. This can be your final summing up answer.
Sure. Well, in terms of the summit calendar, I don't have the master list. I've got sort of a pretty good list, and the global summit calendar is very, very full. And again, I really worry about the proliferation of the number of summits and the increasing frequency of them, just because any given political leader cannot possibly keep up with this. It's exhausting. Just thinking of these past weeks, the leaders had the G20, they had APEC, and they had ASEAN, all one after another. It's exhausting. And remember, in most cases, leaders are flying an awful long way. And, we tend to think about international politics in abstract ways, but these are, it's one of the reasons I really enjoy studying summits, is that these are human things. And look, we're talking about people who are profoundly jet-lagged. And that has a real cost. Profoundly jet-lagged and having a schedule at the summit where they're constantly in and out of meetings, constantly doing bilaterals, constantly, then having to go to a cultural event and have a meal and so on. It is punishing. And having a full schedule like this that's year-round really begins to diminish the likely efficacy of any given summit, let alone like the health and well-being of any given leader. And what's even, being a leader comes with advantages. It's their staff who, I really feel for.
So before I let you go, I know Suzanne said that was your, but I wanted to ask one final question from you, Tristan. Give me an example in all these studying of summits that you've done and been to them and looked at them. What would your example of a successful summit be? Oh dear.
The metric.
Let's finish now.
The metric.
Yeah. I wasn't going to ask you which is the worst. All I wanted to ask you is basically, if you were to say,
far more interesting.
This is a perfect, this actually is a summit that worked. It had a problem. People could have taken years, but, ultimately it came with a satisfactory solution. And I say satisfactory, I'm not saying perfect. I'm just saying satisfactory.
The yardstick that I use is this. If the summit had not happened, would things be the same? In other words, would life just have carried on and we wouldn't notice? Now, often it ends up being the case, but there certainly are events that we can point to and say, yeah, if that summit hadn't happened, then X would not have happened or Y would not have happened. The one that actually immediately jumps to mind was the 2015 St. Petersburg G20. This was in the wake of the chemical weapons attack in Syria. And John Kerry was there, Lavrov and he were meeting throughout, Vladimir Putin and Obama were meeting throughout, and Kate got an agreement on chemical weapons and what to do about Syria. We should, not now, debate whether or not that was a good agreement or whether it was effective or whatnot. But if they hadn't been together there at that moment, I am, it is counterfactual argument, but nonetheless, I don't think we would have had the agreement, certainly not as quickly as we did. So that matters. That's just one example of
Thank you, Tristen, very much. I feel like we really have. Oh God, I was going to use some mountaineering metaphor about icebergs, but it doesn't work. So I'm going to draw it to a close now. Tristen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's been really terrific listening to you. I'm going to observe summitry in a different way from now on, and we'll get you back after the next. When's the next interesting summit?
Next up will be the G7 in Japan.
Great.
I think we must have you back, Tristen.
Thank you.
Looking forward to it.
Great stuff.
Bye.
Thank you.